evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Lauren Kloss. I'm the caseworker with Clarkston Area Youth Association. We are so happy that you are here tonight joining us for our Hooked on Technology presentation. Don't take my ice cream. So we have a very special guest with us tonight, Maria Barata. She's a local therapist. She has her own practice here in Clarkston called Life Solutions Coaching. Right. So for those of you who don't know about youth assistance, we are a prevention program. We actually are all throughout Oakland County. There's one office in every school district throughout the county. We're all about helping to strengthen youth and families in order to prevent any issues from occurring down the road in the future. So we do a lot with prevention. I, as the caseworker, work individually with families, one-on-one on their specific needs and concerns. But then we also have volunteers involved with us to do community programs for prevention. Family education is one of those programs, which you're here tonight for one of our family ed programs. We also do a homework club. We have scholarships for families that can qualify to help pay for camp and skill building scholarships, extracurricular activities. We do the Pinwheels for Prevention program in April. We do a youth recognition ceremony. And we do have a Mentors Plus mentoring program as well. So we do a lot here in the Clarkston community for Clarkston families. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Maria to you and have her present on our Hooked on Technology for 4th through 7th grade parents and students. Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Lauren, and Jamie, thank you for everything that you do. So in our community, there are people that really, really care, and these two fine ladies are definitely them. So let's give them a round of applause. So I do have a lot of information to get through tonight. I'm going to try to get through it efficiently, and we ask that you hold any questions until the end and then take notes, and then I will answer them for you in the end. So my name is Maria, and I do private practice here in Clarkston. I have my own office. Prior to that, I worked for the Sheriff's Department at the Oakland County Jail doing crisis mental health work for the incarcerated population. And then I've also volunteered and mentored a lot of at-risk youth in Clarkston. And the reason I'm here tonight is pretty simple. I just want to inform you of how this process works and what's going on behind the scenes with our technology use. And the reason that I want to do that is because I see a lot of this in my practice and the way that it impacts kids today. So there's things that historically we've done as a society that we can look back at in hindsight and say, hey, maybe that wasn't such a great idea. Years ago, doctors' recommendations during pregnancy, for example, were very different than they are now. And it's one of those things that I'm finding is more of, had I known this or been informed about some of these things, I might have made different choices. So there's a lot of misinformation out there in the world right now. I don't know if you guys noticed, but if you go and Google anything, you're ultimately going to be right because there's information on everything from every side. The information I'm going to be presenting tonight comes out of Stanford, and it is the latest research on the subject. So the first question I have for everybody tonight is, what brought you here tonight? Yes, go ahead in the back. So you want to be proactive about the topic and make sure it's not a problem in your house? That's an excellent reason to be here, and thank you for being here. Go ahead. So you want, I'm sorry, I don't know if it's your child or something you brought with you. So you want your child to recognize some of the issues and the signs and symptoms of something that's going on, and then maybe be able to prevent it in advance. And I thank you for being here. Really, everybody, I thank you for being here because it really does make a difference. And if you can take away even a few bits out of things that we talk about tonight and maybe even share them, it really does make a really big difference. So thank you all. So when we think about being hooked on technology, does anybody have any examples of what that looks like in their household? Yes, go ahead. Okay, right? So having some difficulty maybe taking the kids away from the behavior and then seeing a little bit of backlash or a little reactivity as it pertains to that. Okay, that's a very good point, one that we're definitely going to be covering tonight, and why that happens. So being hooked on technology is essentially having some form of an addictive relationship with that something. So we can be addicted to really anything, whether it be chocolate or a person or an activity or technology. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about what that process looks like and then what we can do to curtail it and prevent it. The definition of addiction is the fact or condition of being addicted to a particular substance, thing, or activity. So this is where I ask about how well do we know our mind? How well do you guys think you know your minds? Pretty well, kind of well. Did you say well? You maybe half of it? No, just one side? Which side do you pay attention to of your brain? Ah, the side that wants to eat candy all day. So we're going to touch on that. You know, we're going to talk about dopamine, which is the same, it's the same molecule with candy, it's the same molecule with technology, it's the same molecule with anything that we like. It's called the pleasure molecule. It's something that brings us joy and happiness, but it is also the movement molecule, and we'll get into that. So dopamine, the more something elicits dopamine, the more addictive it becomes. So has anybody in the room ever been addicted to something like a vegetable? Probably not, right? Because it doesn't really elicit a whole lot of dopamine. And there's things that elicit more dopamine than other things. Chocolate, for example, elicits a decent amount of dopamine. So does gambling. Gambling elicits a great amount of dopamine. And it's similar in ways to technology addiction in the way that it works. Really, all kind of addiction is very, very similar. So Andrew Huberman is a researcher at Stanford, and if anybody's not heard of him yet, at the very end of this, there's going to be a resource link. So Huberman Labs is a really, really great podcast series, and he brings you the most current neuroscience research that exists. It's free. You can listen to it online for free and get that information. He says, dopamine is a currency, and it's the way that you track pleasure, track success, track whether or not you're doing well or poorly. So dopamine is something that can regulate our motivation. And that's really how we are motivated to do things. We do things and then we get a reward, and then we typically want to do more of those things. And there's a natural way in which we can work with that. And then there's a way that is unnatural that creates certain consequences and effects that we'll talk about tonight. So this is probably the most important thing that I'm going to tell you tonight. And we're talking about the dopamine baseline and the dopamine curves. So the dopamine baseline is something that we all have. It's something that we're born with, and it's something that we use every day, whether or not we're realizing it. And it basically is visualized in the form of a line. So that baseline wants to keep us at neutral at all times. That is the goal of the brain. It's not trying to keep you in an elevated state. It's not trying to keep you in a depressed state. It is trying to keep you right at neutral. So what takes us away from that is when we have dopamine increases. And we can have these dopamine spikes, like if we win a game, for example, right? So we win a game and we have this big dopamine spike, and then any spike is followed by a dopamine crash. So pain and pleasure are actually co-located in the brain. They're in the same spot, and is because of this reason. So when we experience a lot of feeling good, we experience feeling worse afterwards, but in essence, it's just returning us back to neutral, which is where we want our minds to be. So when we introduce things that elicit dopamine in a higher way, we actually change that baseline. And the reason that happens is because when we have supernormal stimuli, and that's something like technology. So technology in any form, whether it be a tablet, a computer, or a video game console, or any form of technology, elicits a much higher dopamine response than you find in nature. So that means that the spikes that you get from technology use are going to be much higher, and the subsequent crash from that use is also going to be more intense to return it back to neutral. So the issue that happens is when we're scrolling, or we're playing a game, or watching cat videos, or whatever it is that we're doing, when we're enjoying that process, our dopamine goes up. And then when we start to get away from it, our dopamine comes down, and we don't like that feeling. We don't like the feeling of it coming down, and especially to that level, so we go right back to the activity to increase that dopamine. But what happens is over time, that those spikes go up so high, and they need to come down so much, that the brain eventually says, okay, we need a reset, and we need a new whole dopamine baseline level, because it needs to bring it down in accordance with how high we're bringing up the dopamine. So if the baseline was here, and we have lots and lots of dopamine from technology, for example, that we're using, it has to reset it, the brain resets it, to down here. And so that offsets the spikes in dopamine that we have through technology use. The issue with that is once that baseline is reset to a lower level, that's correlated with depression. And that's when we get into a cycle, because when we're feeling depressed, we need more dopamine. So we get into this cycle without realizing it when we're using technology of any sort too much. So addiction is the progressive narrowing of the things that bring us pleasure, which is happiness and joy. And I don't know if you guys noticed this, but if you binge watch Netflix for a day straight, who's ever done that? Anyone? Yeah, maybe? Okay, I see some hands, some brave hands I see in the crowd. So when we do that, what we might notice is when we first start on that journey at the beginning of the day, we might be really excited about the idea of laying in bed and watching Netflix all day. But by the end of the day, we don't feel that way anymore. And it kind of doesn't make sense. Shouldn't we feel amazing towards the end of the day because we did that all day long? In fact, we feel the opposite because we had dopamine spikes all day, and then we're going to go into more of a crash. And also, the same things that brought us that dopamine in the beginning, we've developed a tolerance to those dopamine spikes, so they're not actually bringing us pleasure anymore. So in addiction, there's two reasons, or two processes that happen. One happens when people want to seek dopamine. They want to seek it to have those feelings of pleasure and joy. The second one, and is most common with addiction, is you can only do the first step initially, and you're spiking your dopamine levels, and as you do that, you're not feeling as much joy in those activities anymore, but you're trying to avoid those dopamine crashes. So you're actually entering into the most common stage of addiction, which is pain avoidance. So we're just trying not to feel bad after we've used whatever it is that we're using, technology in this case. We're trying not to feel as bad, so we're continuing to use it to not go into those withdrawal symptoms. And the brain, meanwhile, is always trying to balance all of this out. So it's working on these processes, but it can't combat what's happening when the dopamine levels that we're getting are so high. And if we think about it in terms of evolution, we haven't had technology in our lives as a species for a very long time. So our brains have evolved predominantly without it. So right now we're going through a really big shift at a very rapid rate where we're using something that spikes our dopamine at astronomical levels, and this is happening really, really quickly. And we're seeing the effects of it in terms of addiction, in terms of mental health, distractibility at school, kids having more anger outbursts, inability to see social cues correctly, respond to social cues correctly. So all these things are happening really, really quickly. And I'm here tonight because I'm seeing it firsthand. I know that over the course of time, there's going to be a lot more conversations about it as Stanford is coming out and different institutes are coming out with more and more research about it. Things will be implemented to try and reverse this process, but I'm telling you guys this tonight so that you can be proactive and informed in the decisions you're making for yourself and for your family. So the other component to this process that is especially important for kids is kids, their brains are developing, and as that's happening, there's different processes that are happening that are just natural in terms of child development. So a child's brain is neurologically very different than an adult brain. The current research is that we don't develop our adult brain until about the age of 25 years old. And so our brain is developing. The quickest time of development is from 1 to 7, but it continues to develop up until about 25. And that's the time when we can really say, hey, we can see things eye to eye. We're responding to things more or less the same. But up until that point, the neurological processes happening for kids are very different than they are for adults. So it makes it extremely important to understand the effects of technology use on child brains in particular. So what also makes this difficult is that children are going through these developmental stages where they're trying to gain autonomy in their family systems. So they're saying, hey, I want to do it this way, I want to try it my way, I want to do this and explore this in a way that feels right to me. And it also can be a time of higher impulsivity when they're trying to do those things. Higher impulsivity is correlated with a higher chance of being addicted to things. The reason I say here what fires together, wires together, is because in our brains, the way that our brain neurology is shaped is we have dendritic maps. So if we were to try to imagine our brain when we're born, and it's not exactly like this because it's a little bit formed already at time of birth, but if we can try to imagine it, it's kind of a blank slate. And as we're seeing things around us, what's happening in our brain is we're actually having growth. So these little dendrites that sort of look like tree branches are growing in our brain and creating neural maps. And these are the neural maps that we're using to understand the world. This is why perception is so vastly different from person to person. It is because of those past life experiences and initial life experiences that have formed the maps that we use over and over again. So when I say what fires together, wires together, is when we have a response in the mind, especially one that elicits a lot of emotions, it fires that map. And it actually creates stronger and stronger connections. This is why it's hard to get rid of old habits. This is why it's hard to learn new things. It's because of these neural maps. And then regarding COVID, I think we kind of know what happened there with technology, and so that's just added a fuel to the fire a little bit. So social media is something that we're getting closer and closer to, if not already using at this age. And it's important to know that social media in research is shown to affect the brain in the same way as drugs do, in the same way as alcohol does. And I'm not going to say that it's good or bad because it can be used for both, but it's really important that we learn to understand how we use technology as a tool in our favor versus it controlling us. Social media can be isolating. Research shows that the more time people spend on social media, the lonelier that they actually feel. It also fosters narcissism, which is really important to know for kids at this age, because as their brains are developing, they're more likely to want to stand out and feel independent and have a sense of this is me and this is what I represent, this is myself, which is completely normal developmentally to do. But when you mix social media into that equation, it can kind of go into hyperdrive. So this is me, but this is what I look like to other people, these are the likes that I'm getting, and then it creates a loop that fosters narcissism because you can't escape that, you're addicted to that process. And so you really start thinking about yourself compulsively, and that can create a lot of issues with self-esteem, self-worth, and just feelings of confidence in general. So we do have tools that we can use to help this whole process and to help curtail it. The reason that I have fire and water up there is because we really don't have to go far. So hundreds of thousands of years of evolution are our friends. There's absolutely no reason in today's day and age with central heating that people should covet homes with fireplaces. That actually doesn't really make any sense, right? We just have something on the wall that we can click and we can make it whatever heat we want to. So why on earth are fireplaces so coveted when looking at houses? And it is because thousands and thousands of years of evolution have shown that fire brings comfort and food and safety and warmth. And that is the effect that it has on everybody to this day. So we still gravitate to some of those evolutionary things that fit with our brains very, very naturally. So a very simple thing that you can do to lower some of your brainwave activity when you're feeling anxious or your brainwave activity is really, really high, you can sit by a bonfire and your brain activity will actually stabilize and become calmer and your anxiety will dissipate because of that evolutionary tool. The same is true for bodies of water. So spending 20 minutes around a body of water, you don't have to do anything, you can just sit there and read a book, actually also changes your brain state and lowers the activity, making your brain calmer. These are also things that naturally give you dopamine and return your dopamine baseline levels to neutral and normal. In terms of water too, I will note, and Dr. Huberman is a huge proponent of this, I have mixed feelings about it sometimes, but he is a huge advocate for cold plunges and cold showers. Those are extremely effective at boosting your dopamine. I think the factor is 2.5. So they boost your dopamine by a factor of 2.5 when you take a cold shower for even just 20 seconds to a minute while you stand in that cold shower. And then that dopamine actually is sustained throughout the day. So you don't get the crash from it. You actually get a sustained boost of dopamine. And the more that you do that, the more you're actually balancing out your baseline to a neutral state. And that's, again, just another simple tool that you can use that's very effective. You don't have to pay anything for it, don't have to go anywhere. You just have to be brave. So when we're asking how much is too much technology, we're really looking at some of the effects that happen as a result of using technology. So how many people here have ever felt like or heard, hey, it's time for dinner, and then you get, oh, come on, or 5 more minutes, or 10 more minutes, or anything like that. So when we're having those responses, although they are seemingly kind of innocent, they tell us a lot about what's happening with our systems. So when our dopamine is in hyperdrive, we actually don't have awareness of our bodies in the same way that we do when our dopamine baselines are neutral. So things like hunger cues go by the wayside. Time is also distorted when our dopamine levels are not where they need to be. So when we're experiencing something, and you might have noticed this with your kids or with yourselves, when you're seeing something, you're watching something on technology, you might think a certain amount of time has passed, and it's actually drastically different. And I see this a lot of the time with parents where they'll say, but I told you 20 more minutes, but into that brain that's engaged in that activity, they're actually neurologically not able to perceive time accurately. So when you're having some of these feedback loops of, oh, but I want more, I want more, I want more, or give me more, that's one of the signs that you know that somebody is really choosing that over even their own basic needs, like food. Has anybody ever here lost power? Yeah. Did anybody get anxious about the fact that they couldn't charge their phone? Yep. So those are signs that kind of show to us that whether we like it or not, we're kind of used to this thing, whether it be a phone or a tablet or video game console or the TV. Like, we actually feel worse without its presence, and that is a sign of withdrawal. So we're not as stabilized in our mood without something. So that's a sign that we're using it a little too much. Has anybody had this experience where somebody's texting you and they expect a response right away? And then they get frustrated? Yeah. And then they get frustrated when you don't respond right away? And they take it personally and they think, what's that person doing? Yep. So we are so ingrained in thinking that everybody has their phones kind of glued to their hips, because a lot of us do, that people actually make those assumptions. And so it goes outside the realm of rational thinking to some degree, because we can't envision a scenario in which somebody doesn't have their phone, for example. And that's another way of just showing us, hey, we might be a little too dependent on whatever this is. Because if you were to replace, everything that we're talking about, if you were to replace it with a substance, for example, and say, hey, if you're doing this and you're not eating, hey, if you're doing this and you can't tell the time, hey, if you're doing this but you're sad without it, we would say that's addiction. It would be very, very clear. But because we're so used to using technology at this point, we're not seeing it as that. But it really is, and it is impacting our brain in these ways, where we're actually becoming a little less happy over time. So we talked a little bit about this. There are adaptive and maladaptive ways to regulate dopamine. Close social connections that release oxytocin have been found to trigger the dopamine system. So this is really important, because we think that sometimes technology connects us and makes us feel less isolated, but what we're seeing more and more is that the more people use technology, social media, chat platforms, texting, and things like that, where we're not actually in person talking, we're not getting our social needs met in the same way, and it's not releasing oxytocin in the same way that it would if we were with that person. So what ends up happening is we're depleted of meeting those social needs, and then we're continuously trying to meet them in the process using technology, which doesn't quite meet them. So we get addicted to that process on that side as well. And were we to do things a little bit differently and in person with one another, then our oxytocin levels would actually be more stabilized, and we wouldn't feel that constant need to connect. So depending on where somebody is in terms of their relationship with technology, and this is something that is individual to every single one of you, different people use technology at different intervals and at different times. But if you're noticing things like frustration, anger, throwing fits, being sad without it, kind of being mindlessly on it, not realizing what you're doing on there, but you're still on it because you don't want to not to be, there's a potential probability that you may need a break from it. And the reason that you want to do that is for your brain to be able to come back to feeling how it actually feels like, so its natural state of being, which is really easy for us to forget because the brain adapts to whatever it is that we're doing. When was the last time anybody was in here without technology for a day? Yeah. So no hands in the room. So okay, I think that it's safe to say that we all probably use it a little bit too much at this point. And so what we can do, in the ideal world, when we're talking about addiction, the quickest way to reverse something in our minds neurologically is to abstain from it. Like when somebody's addicted to a substance, we don't tell that person, hey, you know what, you should go from this amount to maybe just have a little bit a day. It doesn't work. So in treating addiction, that typically doesn't work because of the neural maps that we have. when we're using that same thing, they're activated. And the craving is there, and the spikes that we're used to are there. So the best thing for addressing this is abstinence. So in the perfect world, what we would do, if we want to return back to feeling like what it feels like to be at our normal dopamine baseline level, is to completely abstain from something. So if we were to do that, let's just say, the first 2 weeks would look hard. They would be difficult. Because the first 2 weeks are all the withdrawal symptoms that are associated with that dopamine baseline trying to rebalance itself. And if you guys can imagine, when you have this dopamine baseline and you have these constant high spikes, and you're leaving that behind very rapidly, and the next day you don't have that, the things that bring you joy from normative dopamine levels don't affect you in the same way that those spikes did. So you're feeling pretty low, and your baseline is already lowered at that point, so you're feeling really low. And what you want in that time is more of that dopamine in some way, shape, or form. So if we were to continue on with this process day after day for 14 days, we might not feel great, and people around us might notice. So we might be wise to warn them and say, hey, I'm going through this process, and I might be a little cranky, and I might be a little frustrated, but you can support me in these ways. Week 3 is when things start to neurologically get better, and this is when what I call the sun starts to come out, and what in research a lot of it says the sun starts to come out, because you start to feel like yourself again, and it feels right in a way that you really can't attain doing anything else. So that's when you start to feel better, and the process becomes a little bit more manageable. By week 4, you're back to yourself, you're feeling better, and then what you want to do is maintain that. So you don't want to go back to, let's say, like a day of binge watching Netflix at that point, because the chances of you going back to those old neural maps are still going to be pretty high. So what you can do is you can give yourself limitations at that point, but that's after the week 4 mark. And then you're not going to be as likely to go back to doing something in as compulsive of a way at that point. But if we're not going to go this route, so this is the ideal route, if we're not going to go that route, then we can at least do something like give ourselves a break for a day. So this same system applies in some ways when we do that for a day. We're experiencing mostly the withdrawal symptoms in that day, so we're going to be maybe a little crappier, a little more frustrated without realizing what's going on. But ways that we can offset that is by being in nature, going and being around water, getting some exercise, taking a cold shower, and then it offsets some of those symptoms and withdrawal symptoms. Another great thing that we could do that day is just play a board game. You know, play a board game with your loved ones, with your friends, because that social connection that's releasing that oxytocin in a natural way is going to offset some of the ways that we're feeling bad when we're withdrawing from something. So it makes it a little bit easier, and over time, even taking a day off a week really helps us with our dopamine baseline levels. So something that can make this situation trickier is boredom. And boredom, I look at it as a lack of presence. So boredom is when we just kind of don't know what to do with ourselves, and when our mind isn't used to that stable dopamine level, we tend to fall into this state more and feel it more when we're going from high dopamine to low dopamine. And it's something that can then re-elicit that behavior. So we want to keep ourselves busy if we're trying to abstain from things like technology. Boredom also really highly elicits anxiety. So something else we can do, because dopamine, again, is the molecule that's responsible for pleasure and movement, because those things work hand in hand, what we can do is keep ourselves moving and our bodies moving. And another tool that we can use that's very simple and free is taking a walk. And there's more and more research as to why simply taking a walk is so huge for our brains. One is it's also in the same place as movement is in the same place as dopamine. So when we're trying to deal with that system, we can offset some of what's happening there with movement, and it affects our dopamine system. So when we go for a walk, not only are we outside getting fresh air, which all of that is good for our dopamine, but we're also scanning things with our eyes. And there's a movement that we're doing when we're walking, when we scan from one side to the other side, from the left to the right and vice versa. And that's very different from the way that we're usually looking at technology. And I'll use a phone as an example, but when we're holding our phones and we're scrolling, we're doing the up and down, looking at a very small item in our hands. So we're not really focusing in on everything that's happening around us. And our peripheral vision is not as good because this is very enticing. So walking, we're using our eyes in a different way. We're moving them from side to side. And the reason that we want to do that, and the reason it actually calms us down, is because we're scanning to make sure that we're safe. So the number one thing that our brain is trying to do at all points in time is just to keep us safe. That's its number one job. And the reason why walking calms us down is because it feels like it's doing that job when we take a walk. It feels like, hey, you know what, I have this task, I'm gonna go out there, I'm gonna scan, I'm gonna do it, and then the brain actually feels calmer when it does that. And that also helps with dopamine levels. So it's something very simple, something that you don't have to pay for. 10 or 20 minutes a day really does make a big difference. When we're dancing to music, it's actually the number one way in which we create neurological growth. So if kids can get out and dance more to music, whether it be an educational song or something fun that we do and we come up with, their brain is developing the quickest in that activity. So it's dancing to music, and if there's singing involved, that's even better. Something that the Japanese practice is something called forest bathing, and this is something that is just basically being in the forest. The reason why it's called forest bathing, it has nothing to do with actual bathing. It's you're bathing in the things that fall off the trees. All the little microorganisms, all the little systems of the forest actually have a way in which they work with our brain due to evolution. So forests were a safe place for us as we evolved. They were a place that we can seek shelter, we can find streams, we can build homes out of, we can make fires and find wood. So there's a natural system that exists with nature and trees that actually works with our brain. And if you guys want to find out more about it, you can look up forest bathing. In the Japanese culture, there's a whole movie about it. So it's pretty interesting, and we don't really have to do much, but kind of get back into our backyard. The last point on this slide, in terms of survival and self-preservation, this is kind of a big one, especially for younger kids. So the content of what we're watching sometimes as adults when we're using technology is more evident to us because we're picking and choosing what it is that we want to see. With kids, it's a little bit different because their brain is wired in a little bit of a different way, so they're more prone to finding things online that they maybe shouldn't find, or they don't understand the consequences of finding. So what our brain does is when it's trying to scan for safety, it looks for outliers that don't look safe. So that's its number one goal. So our brain actually pays more attention to things that are negative because it's trying to prevent something from happening or to keep us safe. This is why sometimes people really like the news because, and I don't know if you guys noticed, but have you guys seen a lot of positive news? No, there's not a lot of positive news because it's not attention grabbing. And the reason why it's not attention grabbing is because we just bypass things that are positive because they're not alarming to us. We don't have to check for safety on those things, but we do gravitate towards things that are scary or negative. So why this is so important for kids is because when they find things online or on YouTube, they're going to also gravitate towards that. And what I myself have seen as a parent and have talked to other parents about and witnessed myself is that if I were to type in, say, a character that kids love, like Mickey Mouse, or for example, Sonic the Hedgehog, right? And let's say I'm 10 years old and I want to find a YouTube video on Sonic the Hedgehog. Seems like a pretty innocent thing to do, right? I think Sonic's pretty cool. If you guys haven't seen the movies, he's pretty great. So what I might do as a 10-year-old is look that up on YouTube. And what you'll find more and more is that there's distorted information that you're seeing on YouTube, in games, and information that kids are taking in. And it really can't be filtered out in any way using any algorithm. So if you Google like Sonic XE, you're gonna get this evil version of Sonic that if you watch it, it really doesn't have any benefit whatsoever. But it distorts the idea of the original character in a child's mind. And they're more likely to remember that than the positivity of the original character because of the way that the brain works. So I'm seeing myself more and more of that kind of distorted information. And if we're not paying attention to what our kids watching, we end up in these situations where, well, what'd you see today? Oh, I watched Sonic. Right? And then later on it's, oh, well, Mommy, Daddy, I had this really bad nightmare. Or I'm thinking this. And the kids can't put the two and two together to realize what just happened. But we as parents just need to be more cognizant that this exists. Another example that I have, has anybody ever played Roblox? Yes. Okay, to all my Roblox fans. There's a difference in Roblox. If you guys notice, there's different games. Yes? Are some of the games really fun? Are some of the games scary? Yes. Can you tell me again? So there was a Roblox game you played, and it was a Japanese one? Okay, and then it ended up being kind of scary and scaring your sister? Yeah, so there's a lot of games on Roblox that are scary in nature, and that's one component to it, so they can elicit fear. But there's other games that I'm frankly probably even a little more worried about than that. Some of them, you just really have to look at the content and what they're advocating for. There's like role-playing World War II games where you get to be either party and you're doing things to the other party, so it gets kind of disturbing. But the ones that Roblox is really kind of infamous for are simulator games. Have you guys ever heard of simulator games? Well, tell me more. So you're saying it's role-playing like a doctor or nurse? What happens when you do that? What happens in the game? Is that your dad sitting next to you? Okay, Dad, could you please repeat the last thing for me? Oh, okay. So when we're talking about simulator games, there could be different kinds. So I understand what you're saying. So there's one where you're either the doctor or you're giving birth to the baby and you're simulating the experience, right? Okay. So there's those simulator games, and then there's also a slew of games that are solely based on getting more of something. So there's in all kinds of capacities, whether it be a restaurant or a laundromat or something like that. You're not actually building anything. You're not problem solving anything. You're spending money to get more points in that game And the whole purpose of it is literally just to get more points. So you're not walking really anywhere, you're not exploring anything, you're just trying to get more points. And then these are really, really addicting ones because they resemble gambling the most. And they're also doubly addicting because not only are you using the technology, which is already addicting, but you're using it to get more and more and more of something. So they become really, really popular. And what we need to remember as parents is, this is the time when a child's brain is developing. This is what they're learning. So what does that set them up for? So it's really the content of what we're using when we're using technology becomes really, really important because we're probably not going to cut technology out completely out of our lives. But what we can do is we can pick and choose the content that we're exposing ourselves and our kids to. This is also super important because whatever experiences that we have neurologically, because of the way that our brain creates these dendritic maps, we're more likely to have that again in the future. So if we're addicted to something even once, we're much more likely to be addicted to something again. And that becomes really, really important and something that we just don't have big enough research statistics on right now. This is the statistic. It's happening now. So whatever it is that it's going to be in 10 or 20 years, we'll come out and say, well, in hindsight. But it's, neurologically speaking, this is exactly what's happening. So something else that we can look at in terms of a tool to help us with this is time. So we know that time is distorted when we're doing things that are really dopamine eliciting, such as technology. If we're going to still use technology, we can do that, but we could be a little more responsible about it. So time management becomes one of the tools that we can use. You know, an example of that in a household is to say, okay, from this time to this time, we can use technology. But outside of those times, we're not using technology. And that gives us a little bit of a reward in terms of things that we're doing. We can say, hey, we get all our chores done first. We make sure all of homework is done first. We have dinner first. Did we go on our walk? Did we do maybe some gratitude journaling, which is also hugely beneficial for dopamine boosting? Did we do all those different things? If we did all those different things, we can have our hour of technology and then get off of it early enough before we go to bed, which is super important when it comes to circadian rhythms. So there's a natural process by which we function, and it's kind of like on a 24-hour clock. And the more that we can do right by that clock, the better off we are in terms of our physical health and our mental health. And that's our circadian rhythm. So the way that we can help that process is using light. So when we wake up in the morning, I personally wake up and it's not light for a few hours still, but I make it a habit to turn on as many lights as I can when I wake up, because that helps to balance your circadian rhythm very efficiently. Same is true for the end of the day. You want to do the reverse. So you want to have dimmer lights in the house, you want to have less lights on, and that actually helps to balance out your circadian rhythm. What is a huge obstacle to that is sometimes we use technology right before we go to bed. And when we do that, and we don't get off of it early enough, we're actually messing up our circadian rhythm and our sleep. So when we do that, our hormones aren't as well regulated and balanced, and that can actually lead to things like obesity, cancer, mental health issues, mood changes. So something else that we can do is just get off technology early enough in the evening so we have a little bit of that downtime with no light where we could read or do something else and unwind. And that's going to make a really big difference for our mental health. I personally use something called time boxing. It's just a little journal and it splits up your day into things that you want to do, and then you mark it out by the hour and the half an hour. So that's something that you can look back at and say, okay, from this time I'm in school, from this time I'm in work, and then this is the time, and box it out so your brain can visually see and then return back to the clock for reference as to what you're supposed to be doing. And it just helps the brain kind of be more aware of its own time and time management, so we don't get caught up in that distortion of time. Mindfulness is a hugely beneficial practice in terms of mental health across the board. So it really impacts everything in a very, very positive way, and I would encourage you guys to do more research on it. But essentially, mindfulness is the practice of being present in the moment. And it staves off things like boredom and malcontentment, because you're really just looking in each moment for being present in that moment. So when we're thinking about the future, we're typically in a more anxious state. When we're reminiscing a lot on the past, we're in a more depressed state. And mindfulness really brings us back to the current moment. And from that moment, it becomes a lot easier to function. And there's many, many ways that we can practice mindfulness. There's meditations, there's guided meditations. And kind of like the great thing with technology that I love is there's so much stuff for free online. There really is. There's so many tools that we can use. So we definitely can use technology in our favor. It's just picking and choosing what it is that we're utilizing when it comes to technology. This is something that's also very, very useful for ourselves, but also in any kind of addiction. When we're in a state that's lowered for ourselves, sometimes we find it difficult to empower our own selves. It's hard sometimes to make those good decisions for ourselves when we're in a lowered state. So what we can do sometimes is, even when we're in that state, and there's a lot of research in addiction that shows this, what can pull us out of it is actually helping another person, or being observant and of service to another person, or a cat, or a dog, or a hamster, or watering plants. Just getting outside of our thinking about ourselves helps us to get out of some of those patterns. And that's another way in which we practice mindfulness. And it makes us more content and joyous when we do those things. So another huge tool in curtailing this is community. You guys are all here tonight because you saw this presentation. And maybe it was something that was relevant to you, or something that you wanted to get ahead of, or something that you wanted to find out more about. And what I hear more and more from parents and families that are going through this is almost a sort of defeated, exasperated and defeated kind of mindset. Because everybody's on technology, so then what can you do? It's almost like, hey, there's not much I can do. My child's on technology, they're talking to other kids on technology. It's a lost cause at this point because it's so enticing. It really is so addicting. But there are still things that you can implement as a community. And the more people that are aware of this, the more chances you're going to have at finding other people where you can make those play dates, you can make those plans with friends. You can do those things and get your kids away from it together, and then they come back to doing those things together without technology and want to return to doing those things, thus returning their dopamine baselines to more of a normative state. So that's something we can look around and say, hey, what can we do all together, right? Take our kids to the park, take them on a walk, and just remember to do those things, as opposed to maybe staying in or watching Netflix or doing something else on our phones. So it's fairly simple, but we're kind of going back to things that work versus choosing the things that are maybe more enticing, like technology. So Anna Lemke is a psychiatrist from Stanford, and she was featured in the movie Social Dilemma. If anybody's seen it, that's a great movie, especially as kids get a little bit older, to watch, to just educate ourselves on what it really means to use things like social media, the actual information behind it, some of the impacts that it has on us psychologically, so that as we're maybe allowing or disallowing our kids to use different tools when it comes to technology and electronic use, at least we can know what choices we're making and what really stands behind those things. So Anna Lemke really speaks about resilience and stability when it comes to the dopamine system. And when we balance our dopamine system correctly, we actually become more stable and resilient because we're not looking for that instant gratification and those rewards all the time. We have patience, we have perseverance, we have confidence, we have the ability to achieve tasks and then get a reward and feel good about it. And that's the way that our brain's been designed for thousands and thousands of years. So that's what actually feels good, and that's what's going to make us progress and thrive and learn. And when we get unexpected rewards sometimes, it actually helps us learn faster. So if we're not given $5 every time we do homework, for example, right? We just do our homework every single day. We do it, we do it, we do it, we do it. And then randomly, one time, we give our child a gift card to the movies and say, hey, you've been doing a really great job doing your homework in a timely manner, and I'm really impressed. That reward came out of nowhere. And those are the kinds of rewards that actually stimulate our motivation, learning, and growth in the most efficient way. So when we don't reward everything constantly, but we have these rewards that are sprinkled in, that's what works. So I would encourage you guys to check out the Huberman Lab. And he doesn't talk just about dopamine, it's really all of neuroscience that he covers. And then Anna Lemke created a book called The Dopamine Nation, where she talks all about this as a psychiatrist, and she's seen it all. But I like the two of them because they break things down in both ways. So there's the neuroscience aspect behind it, so you know what the research is, but they also just derive things out of that in a very simple way to bring us things like the dopamine baseline and just little different things that we can do that really, really work. So those are the links for him if you want to check those out as well. So I want to share a little bit of a personal story before I take any questions. So my son is here with me tonight. He's sitting right there. And I was definitely at some point the mom that thought that I had to keep up with what all of the other kids are doing. And that included having a TV in my son's room. And it included having a gaming console. And he already had a phone. At that time, he does go between two households, so it was a little bit of maintaining whatever was at the other household already. And he got introduced to technology heavily from a fairly young age. So when I noticed the effects of it for myself, I put a stop to it. And I said, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to have a TV in the room. We're not going to do the phone. We're not going to do any of that. And he is still alive and well. But he's really come leaps and bounds, as I've noticed. So everything that I'm telling you tonight, I have tested, and it works. And I've seen a huge, huge difference. You know, some of the concerns that I've heard from parents in terms of, well, what about socializing? Everybody's on technology. He can tell you maybe a little bit more about that himself if he wants to in a little bit. You want to? Okay. I'm going to take some questions and then I'll let you talk. You want? Yeah? Okay. So he'll tell you a little bit about his experience, but do you guys have any questions so far about anything? Yes. So the question is, when did I implement change in my household? So we kind of went cold turkey, like in the slide that you saw, the 30 days, back in April. Yeah, so from that time, it's been a very different experience and a very, very positive experience. I can say that I've never felt like we've had a better connection, that just the depth of conversations that we're having, the presence, the lack of frustration, irritability, focus, all those things have improved drastically. My son is 11. He just turned 11. Yep. Does anybody have any other questions? Yes, in the back?
So how long it takes for your brain to go into sleep mode
I'm sorry, so how long before your brain goes into what mode?
That's sleep, like you want to go to bed at 10. So how long before you're able to stop using any technology?
So the question is, how long before bed should you stop using technology?
Yeah.
And so the answer to that is it's a few different, I can give you two different answers. So one, you want to stop using technology at least an hour before bedtime so that your brain has time to relax and to return its dopamine levels back to baseline, so you're not in a spiked state that's elevated by the time you're going to sleep. So that's actually going to help with your REM cycles because your brain is getting into a calmer state naturally. It's not going straight from high spike dopamine activity straight to sleep. It has a little bit of that time to calm down naturally. But the other answer to your question goes back to the circadian rhythms. So the circadian rhythms, you want to have the least light possible after the sun goes down in your house, and that's to maintain those circadian rhythms. So that the circadian rhythms impact a lot more than dopamine, and the effects of that are more pervasive than just the dopamine system. So that impacts your health in a major way too. So if you were going to go that route, then you really don't want to be using technology after the sun goes down if you're really trying to balance your circadian rhythms. Of course. Yes, go right ahead. Okay, so the question was, if the 30-day method was to be implemented, would it be okay to still have the phone for texting and for phone calls during that time, or would that kind of derail the process? So if we're going to go, that's a much better way of doing it. So I will say that. It's a much better way of doing it to just have the text and the phone calls, because while that is going to increase the dopamine, it's not going to increase it that much because you're not engaged in all those things that you were on your phone before, but you can still keep in touch with people and use it in moderation. But I will say that initially, if you were going to take that approach and do the texting and the phone calls, I would eliminate the phone maybe on a Friday and then not reintroduce it whatsoever until Monday. Because when you're reintroducing that phone those first few days, your brain is so associated with those dopamine spikes and the things that happen on that phone that those first 2 days are going to be really, really hard to have that phone, but it's not really doing anything. It's like a constant re-trigger. So those first 2 days, it would be better to do something outdoors, to play board games, to completely distract yourself from it, and then after 2 days, implement the phone, but just say now it's for only text and call, and that will make it a lot easier. Does anybody have any other questions? Yes?
So kids today spend hours every day in school on screens too. How do you best manage that? Because that's well beyond their control. I don't think they're still getting tons of time on screens and all at school.
So the question, or the comment is that at schools, kids are getting tons and tons and tons of screen time nowadays. So they're having it, it's like a double whammy. You have it at school and you have it at home. And so that's a really, really good question or comment that you're presenting. And I think it's one of these things where in 10 years, we're going to reflect back on that. And that's really the kind of the sad answer for this moment. The reason that we've skyrocketed into Chromebooks is, one, from the teacher's perspective, the kids are used to technology, so they're more engaged on the technology because it is more enticing. It creates more of that dopamine boost in the classroom. It makes the kids really resonate with that object. So obviously for teachers, they get kids focusing right away. And so it's also a little easier to redistribute homework instead of passing it out, to keep in touch with kids, to check your messages instead of, it's hard. How are you going to answer all these messages at different times of the day if they're not coming in text form? So I get the convenience factor of it, and that's why we've seen the flooding of that into the schools. but it doesn't stop this process. So the more that we become aware of the research, the more we're able to make some of those changes and say, hey, this doesn't really work for my child. You know, or maybe I want to sign a slip that says, I don't want that. I want some other alternative methods for how my child can learn that doesn't include technology. There's also alternatives like Waldorf schools that really, they don't practice a whole lot of technology use, and different schools that try to abstain from that because they're following the most current research. But it is definitely an issue because it compounds the situation in a very significant way. And again, the thing to remember is what we're creating in terms of the neural maps of our kids is the way in which they're going to interact with the world. So if they're looking for those dopamine spikes that we can't mimic naturally, they're always going to be set up for addiction to technology, and that's what we're seeing. Yes? So you're saying to counterbalance some of the effects of what's happening with the dopamine levels at school on technology, you're using exercise and saying, okay, that was a lot of technology, so we already have to offset that. And that's actually the right mindset. So if you're looking at the research and the science behind it, that's what you absolutely should be doing if you want to offset some of that effect. So you're kind of ahead of the game, and then I'm going to say yes to that. That is good role modeling. So exercise increases your dopamine levels by a factor of 2.5. So you're naturally creating that sustainability at that level. But you could also go on walks. You could also do a gratitude journal. You can spend time just connecting to each other, just being in close proximity and having conversations about things, or reading a book together and discussing it. That creates that oxytocin boost that makes us feel better, and it offsets some of that technology use effect that we're seeing at the school. Proper nutrition is also huge. So there's things that, nobody gets addicted to broccoli, but we get addicted to sugar, right? And if we are looking at sugar contents in our foods, and I don't just mean candy, I mean bread and all sorts of different things, syrups that we're using, we can see how that also creates those dopamine spikes. So sugar is doing the exact same thing, just in a different way. It's creating those higher spikes. So that's what, if we're trying to avoid that, to create neutrality in our brain, we're just trying to stay away from the stuff that does that, to maintain it at neutral. Any other questions? Okay, well then, Sasha, I'm gonna leave you to it to blow everybody's minds with your experience. You want to sit there? Or you want to come up here?
No, I want to sit here.
You do? Okay.
Okay, so with my experience in technology, before when I was using technology, I didn't feel very great. I always wanted more, and I was like, can I have 5 more minutes, and sometimes I would sneak and take my phone, and just play on technology for a while, when I'm not supposed to, and it's, and the next day, I wouldn't feel great, my dopamine would crash down, and sometimes it was so bad that I would feel sick sometimes, my body would make it so I feel sick, so I don't do that, and, well, it didn't feel great, but I just kept on wanting more technology, and I got really frustrated sometimes when I lost in a game or something, or someone beat me in a game, or it lagged. I would get really frustrated and angry, and then I would be sometimes I would be okay, fine, it's okay, I'll win the next game, and it wasn't really healthy, and sometimes it was like I would have my friends over at my house who are addicted to technology, and then we would play for a while, and then like we would play together like on the same team or something, and then we would both like not have a good time, and we would both get frustrated, and sometimes it would get like sometimes if my friends were really addicted to technology even more than I was back then it could get violent and not safe, because sometimes they would start to throw things or get really angry. And it's now that my mom has had it so I have like no more technology, it has felt so much better. We go into nature, we take hikes, we do arts and crafts, we always make like experiments, and we do a bunch of fun things. And like once in a while, like on Friday or something, we have like movie nights, and it's much more fun. And when my friends come over for like a sleepover party, it feels so much better. Like my friend, he doesn't get sleepovers very much, and we went to the Renaissance Festival, and we were outside like all day. And he said, "This is like the best sleepover ever. This is the best weekend ever. Like I'm not on technology, and I'm out here with you guys. It's super nice." So I think that having less technology is much better.
Thank you, Sasha. That was really nice.
Thank you.
So any other questions before we wrap up? Well, I just want to give you guys a round of applause, because it really does make a difference if you take away even a few things from this presentation, and if you can share them and share a difference in perspective, maybe even if you change one thing, you know, it really does make a difference for your quality of life and ultimately for what we're all experiencing. So I just want to give you guys a big round of applause that you're all here tonight and not binge watching cat videos or Netflix. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, Maria. Can everyone give her one more round of applause? I think it was wonderful. And Sasha, too, for sharing his story. So thank you all again for coming. We really hope that you enjoyed this presentation, that you got a lot of information out of this, and please, take it home, take these tips to heart, share it with others, and let's spark a good positive change to help prevent any of our kids falling down this path of technology addiction. We do have surveys, evaluations on the tables. I think one table in the back might not have them, but there's extras, so I'll grab some for you. So we do ask for your feedback. If you could please fill one of those out for us, and either myself or Jamie, who's floating around, we can collect it from you. And again, we appreciate you very much for coming and your time tonight, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.